Hi everybody, Kathi Hanson here. I'm super excited to be able to share with you guys today one of my absolute favorite specialty pencils of General Pencils. It's their Sketch and Wash Water-Soluble Graphite. Here are just a few pieces of art I created with this, combining some of the special effects I want to share with you guys today. So I hope you sit back, relax, and enjoy this session. First thing I want to share with you guys is how quick and easy it is to establish several values in an object using the Sketch and Wash pencil. There's just a few things you have to remember when you draw directly on the paper. You're usually going to be using watercolor paper or mixed media paper that has a little give, so you want to draw with a light touch. For a light value, just draw lightly. If you want a medium value, draw it a little darker. If you want a dark value, make several passes. You don't press harder, you make passes. And right off the bat, this is going to give you a great visual on the range of values you can create with this pencil. Light, medium. Look at how all the lines dissolve and you've got liquid values. I just love this pencil. Okay, so that's the first thing you got to remember. The second thing you need to remember is if you are drawing the entire object with the pencil, give yourself some hit and miss lines. And what I mean by that is if you will break in the lines, because if I were to totally outline this, I'm going to have the same value all the way around this pair, and I'm going to flatten it. So the white of the paper is my light value. All I want to do in this first step is establish a middle value. Okay, and less is more. I can always come back once this dries and add another layer over it, wet it, to further develop additional values. It's so much easier to add more than to try to subtract it. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I wet the lightest area first. That will help guarantee it stays light. You're going to notice I'm going to have more than two values because as I activate this and it hits the water, it's going to dilute and create more values. So ideally, I'm going to get several values. Notice I have not lifted the brush off the paper at all. Okay, I'll explain why in a minute. Now we're going to flip this puppy. Start over on this side and do the same thing. Let some of that start going into the wet area as I develop the edge here. Same thing down here. While it's still wet, if you've gone outside your lines, you can effortlessly tighten those lines up to create your pair. Boom! How is that? Now, when you draw on dry paper, the lines are going to be stationary. You can leave them alone or wet them. I'll show you in a second. But if you draw on the paper while it's wet, look at how bold that color is. That is because as the core, the pencil goes over the moisture, it wicks it up and just starts dissolving it. So boom, there is your pair effort. The more you play around with your Sketch and Wash pencil, you're going to find that if you just slightly manipulate a little bit different, you can create a lot of subtle changes and differences within elements. So for instance, just like the pair, I'm going to draw on wet, and the areas I want lighter, I'm just not going to put as much or if any pigment at all. Always wet the light area first. Now come in and just make sure the brush hits all of the pigment lines until they totally dissolve. So this is all created with just one value. It's where the water ebb and flowed gave you a lot of additional subtle values. If right off the bat you want two values, distinct values I should say, you still want to leave a little bit of the white of the paper in some spots. Then you come back again, and remember you don't press harder, you layer more down. And you notice it's wider here than here and even a little wider there. You never want to just make the same width line because, again, it tends to flatten an object. Wet the light area first and go into the medium value, never letting the brush lift up. Go into the dark area then. Voila, look at all those gorgeous values. And actually, while it's still wet, I personally like to leave it and see how much the water's going to pass the additional pigment out. But if you definitely know you have a distinct line that is not going to soften, take the water out of your brush, and while it's still wet, you can gently tickle it and pull it out further. Okay, now we're going to draw the third one. Remember, for the first two examples, I said do not lift the brush. Let it go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That is because a watercolor brush is meant to release a little more fluid every time you touch it to the paper. And as you're blending out your lines, if you keep doing this, you're going to have this huge puddle. And really, all those values are just going to end up one wet, soupy mess. And 9 times out of 10, there's going to be too much water on the paper for you to control. So always tell them, lay the brush down and don't lift it up until all the lines have dissolved. Except on this technique, if you would like to have a little bit of texture showing in it, just get in and get out. Don't totally dissolve those lines. And you see, let me pull this up so you can see it a little better. Look at all the texture as well as values you have created in this. Another thing you can do is, if you want distinct lines showing in an area, wet it, totally dissolve all the lines. And just like in the top section of the pear, remember if you draw on paper when it's wet, you're going to get bolder lines. So while that's wet, just let that pencil rest on it and create some very distinct dark lines. Well, now that the train is gone, sorry about that, guys, I'm going to continue on. So, right off the bat, can you guys tell every one of these has a slightly different look? Now, some additional looks that I like to use, especially when I want something very soft and airy, is a palette technique. You notice on a separate piece of paper here, this is 90-pound watercolor paper, I just draw several swatches. Then I can pick the pigment up with my brush and use it like a watercolor. I do the same thing with my watercolor pencils, by the way, guys. I make paper palettes for them as well. And when I want to work wet on wet or whatever, I activate that pigment and then I can just paint with it. Look at the gorgeous color in the Kimberly watercolor pencils. Okay, I digress. So, palette color, wet your brush. If I want a light value, whole bunch of water in the brush, and I will get a very light value. If I want a dark value, I have more pigment to water ratio. See how I can, again, make all these different values just by how much water versus pigment I have in my brush. So I am going to load my brush for a palette technique. If you apply it on dry paper, it's going to be one value and stationary. Now, I purposely did that. I'd like to let you know that if you don't really have your brush totally loaded and you apply it, you're actually going to get a great distress line, which is cool. But if it's really wet and loaded, you are going to get all one value. See how soft and airy that is. Now, if I wet the paper prior to it, and again, if you want to leave some of the white of the paper, just don't wet it all because the pigment's only going to go where it finds moisture. I'll load that brush again. If you drop it on wet paper, you will most likely get more than one value because, again, the water's going to be moving it. So again, this is another totally different look. And this is what I mean about they're all slightly different and subtle. I can see right now I can throw a little more in because this is nice and wet. That would even give me more values. Why I like to show you all these different effects on trees is many times if you're doing a grouping of trees, it's so much more interesting if every tree trunk is slightly different and has its own personality. That's why I turned around and I showed you all these subtle techniques. Now, the next thing I want to do, I dried some in advance, is, for instance, even with the pear I did earlier, I purposely made it super light so I could show you how I could put an additional layer on. But now that I've shown you how you can create a little texture, notice the texture I put in there. And that was just because I did not let the brush pass enough times over it to dissolve all the pigment. So here's a way to get very, very subtle value in a light valued object. So going back to the tree trunks again, let's say we wanted the left side darker on this. If I draw and wet, again, remember, make it different lengths and widths, the additional, and very light touch. If you want the pigment to travel out this far, wet it this far, because you have to allow enough water for it to continue to wick out until it dries. Otherwise, you'll have a hard line of color, even though it's a lighter line of color. And because this won't reactivate, I wet the whole thing. Now I come into the area where I drew the pigment, and I let the water do all the work for me. That water catches that edge, slowly softens it out so you don't have a hard edge. If you've done the palette technique for your second dark, what you're going to do is, again, well, you can do it one of two ways. I'm going to put some more, load the pigment up, lay it down, rinse my brush, and start way back here with a little damp moisture first again, and then let those two edges connect and it'll soften out. Both of these create a darker value, but you see how when you draw and wet it's bolder color, when you palette technique it's going to be softer. Now, sometimes young kids have a hard time doing that blending out, so here is another way to do it. Have them wet the surface first, almost to the very edge. Grab some of the color and just lay the brush down so it connects with the dry and the wet paper at the same time. Notice, never lifted the brush. So that is an easier way for them to get that nice side float. Another thing you can do, which I love, is sometimes I will start an object with a few layers of the sketch and wash to get these subtle values, because look how quickly you can establish values compared to drawing them in with several degrees of pencils. But you can come back once you have dried that sketch and wash pigment and continue to build off of it with traditional graphite pencils too. So sometimes I like to do that if I have limited time for everyone to be able to create something in the classroom that really has a lot of depth and detail. Now I want to show you some really cool special effect techniques. And I'll do the palette technique on one and a draw and wet on the other. So if I like cool fractured lines, and again, leave a lot of the white of the paper. This is going to be bolder. It would have been softer with palette color. Take plain old simple plastic wrap. I gotta find my plastic wrap. Hiding under here. So I'm going to activate the pigment. You do not want to use microwave plastic wrap. It doesn't like to crinkle. Now, I'm going to dissolve all the lines, but if you wanted a little bit of texture in there too, you just wouldn't have dissolved all the lines. While it's wet, you're going to lay this down and see what design it wants to make on its own. It's going to start connecting with that paper and create all these little fractured lines. If you don't think it's moved as much as you would like, squish it a little bit. Squish it a little bit. I'm trying to get the shine out of it. That is a pattern that I created. It's still wet enough, if I have more than I want, you can loosen it until you get the design you want. That makes really cool textured bark. Now, if you let this totally dry, the line's going to be very distinct. When it's halfway dry to 3/4 dry, if you lift it off, then you've removed that wall. Some of the color is going to walk back in, and those lines will not be as distinct. And what I mean by that, here's a finished one. These lines are very distinct. So this one I'll pull off a little earlier so you can see. The second one that's kind of cool, I'm going to do the palette technique. And that is with something called press and seal. It's right in the kitchen area, just like plastic wrap. Glad makes it. It's called press and seal. So I'm going to turn around and I'm going to make this nice and soupy. Nice and soupy. And while it's still wet, you just lay this down. You don't smush it, because as it lays down, it creates this nice suction and creates all of these cool pock marks. Here is a dried example of all those pock marks. Very subtle, very, very cool. And then another cool thing I like to do, if I just want to preserve a little bit of the white of the paper, I have no intention of going back and putting any additional pigment, whether it's dry pencil or sketch and wash. I love just taking a piece of wax paper, and then I'm going to take a stylus, a pencil, the chisel edge of a brush, and I'm going to rub it against it. I have now transferred that wax onto the paper, and when I turn around and I put that pigment over it, I have created that little bit of a natural white distress line. So those are 3 more really cool ways you can work with the Sketch and Wash Water-Soluble Graphite Pencil. Guys, I have less than 2 minutes left, so last but not least, how to make a cool birch tree. Super fast, super easy. What you're going to do, have a sanding paddle ready, create the shape of the tree with water, grab a sanding paddle and a Sketch and Wash pencil, run the sanding paddle over the tip of the pencil, establish where you want the pigment to go. It was wetter here, so you're going to notice it wicked more stationary where it's drier, less is more. You can always come back and add more. Only sticks where it's wet. While the paper is still wet, take all the water out of your brush, pinch the belly. Now we want a super light touch. We're going to barely make contact like baby butterfly kisses. Barely make contact with all of this to drag those particles, take the shine away. Look at that cool effect I got with that. While it's still wet, you are going to take a second Sketch and Wash pencil. I flag them. These are my wet ones. I'm going to dip it in water, and then when I lay it down, it's not only going to make a super bold mark, but all that extra moisture is going to wick out. Tap it if you didn't get enough. And see how those additional values you're going to get? Soft additional values. See what the pencil's going to create by itself. See what I mean about wicking out and creating soft additional values. Now, you're not supposed to wet this pencil, so maybe a year from now, every time you go to sharpen it, it is going to break. And it's just time to pitch it. But you know what? I will gladly do that to be able to get these cool effects right off the bat. Now, super wet is what I use and drew directly with the wet pencil to get a bold branch. I drew in wet and then only wet certain areas to get not only more than one value in there, but you notice I didn't activate all the pigment, so it's got a little bit of texture. And of course, good old-fashioned palette technique is what I did here. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free at any point in time to stop by my website, KathiHanson.com. I'm hoping to get a bunch of cool little videos up there. And also GeneralPencil.com already has a lot of cool videos on their website, and we are going to be continually adding to that. So thanks again for sharing your time with me, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Take care. Bye now.